Welcome back, everybody, to Season 2 of the Chaplaincy on the Go podcast. My name's Josh, and I'm your host for the podcast. And this podcast is brought to you by the Fearless Chaplaincy and my good friends at Care Portal. Care Portal is a national nonprofit that offers a technology platform to help families who are at risk of moving into the foster care system. It connects local agencies and institutions with individuals and organizations that want to provide help, bring resources, things like beds or financial needs that can help a family stay together for the long term. And so we're thankful for their partnership in the podcast. And I'm excited for our next season as we enter into continued conversations on mental health and emotional health. Joining me today is Rick Feria, not a new face and voice to the podcast. Rick has been on the podcast before. Rick is the care pastor at Ridgepoint Community Church and part of the Fearless family of churches. He is also a chaplain with the Fearless family of churches and the Fearless Chaplaincy. And Rick and I have spent a good amount of time together over the last couple of months talking about mental health and emotional health and spiritual health with individuals all over West Michigan. And Rick, we're super excited to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being here today.
I am happy to be back on again. Thank you for the opportunity.
You are welcome. And we're really going to dive right in here with a conversation in a long series on depression and understanding depression right now. And you may be listening to this in a time of your life or a season of our year where it's sunny and beautiful and warm and summer is upon us. And we praise God for that, and we're thankful for you. But right now in Michigan, where we are currently recording this podcast, it is February. And Rick, I always call February the armpit of the year. I find there are no redemptive qualities to February whatsoever. That's why I believe that February is a shorter month than all the others, because people intuitively knew that February was just going to suck all the time.
That was very creative and thoughtful of whoever designed that calendar.
It was kind of them. It was kind of them to do that because February is just not great. And you get Valentine's in there. But the truth is, depending on your relational status, Valentine's Day might not be a pleasant experience for you.
True.
And right now, as I peek outside, it is gray and it is gloomy. And boy, does that ever have an impact on the human soul.
Absolutely. And I also have come to realize why so many people go down to Florida in February.
Have you found that the older you get, the less you want to be in cold weather?
Yes. And add that into the fact that I got used to Colorado winters for a while where there was so much sunshine. So we didn't feel the need to escape as much as since we moved back to Michigan 4 years ago.
There is a lot to do with seasonal affective disorder or seasonal affect disorder. They call it SAD. We're going to talk about that a little later in this season when we talk about seasonal depression and some of that. But it's worth bringing up that if you are one of those individuals, so roughly 75% of people, incidentally, living in Michigan just don't do well with gloomy days. And if you're one of those people who fall into that 75% category, you might find in a season of the winter where depression is a little more severe or anxiety is a little more intense. And maybe for the better part of the year, you're doing all right and you can muddle through or you can get by. And it's a little harder to deal with all of that in the winter months. And part of that has to do with the season. Part of that has to do with the lack of sunshine, the cold, not being able to be outside the same amount. And we'll talk about some things that you can do to weather that. But you may find it a little more intense. And sometimes people say that in the winter months, that's like the worst time to try to tackle your mental health. I actually disagree. I find that in the winter months, it's the best time to tackle it because all of your symptoms, if you have them, are more severe, they're more pronounced, and you can see them a little more clearly. And so that's one of the reasons why we want to talk about mental health, we want to talk about some of these realities of depression and how it comes up. And I thought, Rick, to maybe start off the conversation, to have you share a little bit about how our unprocessed emotions, specifically anger, how that leads to elements of depression and how do we approach anger. I had a professor in my graduate studies that said the effective definition of depression is anger turned inward. And anger unexpressed is what leads us to these depressive episodes. And so, Rick, why don't you just share a little bit with us? How do we need to understand anger? How do we see it in terms of depression? And what are some of the things that we need to be aware of, especially if we're going through maybe a season where things are a little more intense?
The first thing that comes to mind, I think, Josh, is that probably anger in many circles gets a bad rap. I think there can be messages communicated about anger and having anger that keep us from experiencing it, keep us from acknowledging it, keep us from being authentic and honest about it. And I know that's been true for me at different times in my life. And because there is that direct link between anger turned inward and depression, if we're not giving ourselves permission to acknowledge that emotion and deal with it in a constructive way, then we will find ourselves struggling with depression and all the symptoms that come along with it.
So, Rick, tell us then, if anger gets this bad reputation and we seem to look at it in this negative, almost destructive way, what is the appropriate way to understand and look at anger?
Yeah. I believe that we are created with a physical part. Our bodies were created with a soul that has to do with our will, our choosing, and our emotions. And we're also created with a spirit. So if we're created with an emotional side, we need to come to see that, number one, emotions are a gift. And emotions are a normal part of life as we're meant and designed to go through life. And so seeing emotions and the emotional part of us as a gift and as a good thing, and that they need to be expressed and communicated, is the foundation, I think, of the beginning of a good perspective and a good, healthy perspective on anger and all the emotions that we have.
So you're saying that because we are created with emotions, that all of the emotions that we have, even the unpleasant ones or the ones that we don't like to acknowledge, those are necessary for us to be whole and us to be like thriving in our lives.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I don't think God intended for us just to survive this life. I think He designed and created us to not just survive, but to thrive and to experience life to the fullest. But if we're not seeing that emotional part of us and viewing emotions as a gift from God, as being all of them being legitimate and all of them being normal to have, then we can set ourselves up for, instead of experiencing life to the full, experiencing the opposite and experiencing less than what we were designed to experience in life personally and in our relationships with other people.
So if we deny unpleasant emotions, we deny things like anger.
Mm-hmm.
And it's possible that people listening, I know I grew up in a family where sometimes there were some explosive, angry moments. And from a young childhood, that kind of taught me that anger wasn't good.
Yeah.
Anger was naughty.
Yeah.
It was naughty to be angry
Right.
in my, kind of younger years. And then I essentially just bottled my anger up. And as a teenager, I'm sure you have experience with this with your sons and maybe people that you've talked to, maybe in your own life. As a teenager, I would have these moments where I couldn't bottle it up anymore.
Yeah.
It just wouldn't stay in a bottle, Rick. And I was like a pot on a slow boil.
Yeah.
And eventually all I was really looking for was just some sort of opportunity to be an outlet for my anger. I didn't know it at the time, but that's what was going on. And then wouldn't you know that wreaked havoc on my young adult years and then later on in my marriage, because I would try to bottle it all up, keep it all in, and it would start to like gnaw at me.
Yeah.
And then it would come out in inappropriate ways at inopportune times.
Yeah.
And that's part of what we're talking about here is that you have this emotion. You feel this emotion.
Yeah.
This emotion is meant to move. That's why it's called emotion. And you got to get it out in some way.
Yeah.
So what are some of the challenge points if you don't let it out? Obviously, there's some relational damage, but what are some of the things that you've seen over your career and through your life?
And in my own life too, in my own experience with anger in my life, I tend to be a suppressor. And so I'm still learning how to deal with emotions in a more healthy way, even at this stage of my life. But yeah, for me personally, and then I'll talk about, how it comes out in other people's lives sometimes is, as you were saying, you bottle it all up. And for me, I thought, it's okay for me to feel certain emotions, but some of these emotions that don't feel good, like anger, I shouldn't express that. And it was even maybe wrong to express that. So as I learned to deal with things in that way, I became inauthentic with people because I would put on, and I still can put on this front when I'm feeling these emotions. If I'm still believing that they're not a gift and they're wrong, then I can still suppress them and put on this front with other people. And that builds up, as you were saying. And I'm not an explosive anger kind of guy. Sometimes that's the road that some people take.
That's the road
anger.
I take.
Okay.
Yep.
My road is to become quiet, to withdraw, to maybe subtly through sarcasm or just other, I guess we would call them in the psychological world, maybe passive aggressive ways of trying to get at people or to communicate my anger. And of course, none of those build very good relationships. They don't build authentic relationships. They don't lead to real intimate relationships. And so as I have learned to work through some of this myself, I've seen, as I've grown in it personally, the benefit in my relationships with other people, my wife, obviously, my relationship with God too, because I think for a long time I felt like I could express emotions to God when I was happy and when things were going well, but he wasn't even a safe place in my mind to express those things. And so it affected my relationship with God in a deep way as well.
What about how this unexpressed anger thing, how that plays out in maybe some of the people that you've worked with over the years, met with. What are some of the casualties of that?
Mm. Well, I think similar to the casualty in my own life, with other people as well, if we take the passive route like I did, like we talked about earlier, I don't know myself very well.
Mm.
I can become depressed and withdraw from life. It can affect us physically. We can experience physical symptoms that we think maybe are just physical, but they're more related to how we're dealing with anger or other emotions. It affects us relationally to the point of loss of energy, inability to sleep, all the classic symptoms of depression.
Yeah.
To the point of, is life worth living anymore? Do I still want to be here? And thoughts of suicide, suicide attempts, all of the classic things that can come along with depression, which is that inward turning of anger.
That's an interesting point you bring up. So we've talked about it on the podcast before, but the vulnerable age and stage of life for men at their highest risk of suicide is about 45, 55 and up. So right in that pocket of 45 plus. And a couple of things happen in that time. One, you start to lose friends. So men over 50 don't make new friends. And at 45 to 55, your kids, they stop playing sports. And so you lose the kind of men that you associated with through sports. Your kids graduate from school. You don't have those same connections. You have on the flip side too, you have the reality that men lose their ability to compartmentalize at 45 plus. So right around 50. I don't know if you remember this or not, but there was a time when I was still young in the 90s, late 90s up to the early 2000s, there was this weird phenomenon of men who they were making their way back to the shores of Normandy, and they were revisiting the beaches where they had fought in combat in World War II. And they found that all of these men who had fought in combat as young men for 30 years or more were able to compartmentalize what they had been through in combat. And then as they got to their late 40s, 50s, up to the 60s, they could no longer keep that neatly in a box. And so they had to make their way back to revisit so they could process through what they had been through. I think anger works the same way. So as we're younger, and this is really important for those of you who are younger listening to this, maybe you're youngish, let's say you're 20s, 30s, 40s, you maybe can keep your anger in a box most of the time. You can, maybe there's bad days, or your kids lip off, or your wife says something to you that just irks you and you fly off the handle and you're explosive, or like Rick, you withdraw a little bit. But for the most part, you can keep it in check and you can keep it contained to the point where you can like maintain your marriage, be a decent dad, and hold a job. After 50, I just want to tell you, if you have not learned to process through your anger, you're in trouble because that bill is going to come due and you won't be able to keep it in check the same way. And it makes me wonder, Rick, if that's one of the reasons why those suicide realities become much stronger, because you don't have friends, you don't have the ability to cope, and you don't have a way to keep your anger in check. Like it's just there all the time, and if you don't know how to handle it, it's going to get a handle of you.
That's an interesting fact that I was not aware of, but that makes perfect sense because I have passed through that stage of life. And I'm shaking my head going, yeah, you're exactly right. That makes complete sense.
So have you experienced that a little bit?
Yeah. I have more time on my hands to either suppress or think about things.
Yep.
Because the kids are out of the house.
Man, that quiet is eerie, isn't it?
The quiet is eerie. Whole different stage of life, empty nesterhood, not being able to compartmentalize as much. That makes complete sense to me. So yes, without knowing that stat, wow, I'm learning something here myself today too.
I don't know if you remember the G.I. Joe, the cartoon. They used to do these PSAs, these public service announcements at the end of every episode.
Yeah.
And some kid would be like on a tricycle riding by a down power line, and the kids are like, oh, you should go over and check it out. And then like one of the G.I. Joes would drop down, from a, parachute, jumping down from a plane or a helicopter.
Yeah.
And they would explain the danger of a power line and say not to go near it. And then, the kids would say, oh, now I know. And then G.I. Joe would say, and knowing is half the battle. And so I was whenever I learned something new, I'm like, oh yeah, now I know. And knowing is half the battle. Yeah. Cool. Like, hey, we're talking about anger. We're talking about some of these things. We're talking about how our brains and bodies work. All of this information is important to know, but knowing is half the battle. The other half of the battle is actually not going under the power line or knowing what to do when that anger comes up. Yeah. And but before we get to that, I think it's important. And I know you've been a pastor for a long time. I've been a pastor not as long as you have in ministry, but I have had this question a couple of times, and it revolves around this verse, which I'm sure you've heard before. Ephesians 4. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. It's really in your anger. Do not sin.
Right.
Do not let the sun go down when you're angry. Do not give the devil a foothold.
Yeah.
And so I think, could you maybe break down a little bit? Because I think sometimes that verse gets taken out of context.
Yeah.
And it's misunderstood. So can you break that down for us a little bit and tell us, like, what does that actually mean in terms of this whole idea of expressing our anger and dealing with our anger in healthy ways?
Yeah. In your anger, do not sin. I think another version says, be angry.
And don't sin.
And don't sin.
I like that version too.
Wow.
Yes.
So it's almost, that version, it's written as a imperative or as a command. Like, okay, be angry. Well, if everything in the Bible is true and inspired by God, and we're instructed to be angry, well, doesn't that legitimize that emotion for us?
It sure does. And in that respect, and I really appreciate you saying that, because it's an imperative, it also then, I guess, presupposes there are some things you should be angry about. Yeah. And so why is anger helpful? And what are some things that maybe we should be angry about? We should be all right with being angry about. We don't need to apologize for being angry about. What are some of those?
Yeah. Well, the definition of anger is a normal emotional response to perceived injustices or what's the word I'm looking for? Perceived injustice or, hold on.
You don't have to feel bad about checking your notes, Rick.
I'm a note guy.
Yeah.
Perceived threats or injustices. So when we're feeling threatened, that means there's a danger that we're sensing.
Yeah.
That there's maybe a hurt we've experienced, that there are ways we're being treated that are a threat to our well-being that we should not ignore, and that we should, in response to those kinds of things, normally feel anger.
Yeah.
We should be angry about those things.
Yeah, I really like that. It's a normal response to a threat or a hurt or a pain or something that we feel intensely. A few months ago, and I think I shared this with you, we had an instance in our family where my son was being bullied on the playground. And I found out about that.
Yeah.
And you know what, Rick?
Yeah.
I was angry, and that's not bad. In fact, that's normal. Yes. It's an appropriate response.
Yes.
And I love the statement you say about injustices, because when something is not the way it should be, when something is wrong, when someone's been hurt, a people group is marginalized, something has happened to someone we love that is not fair or right. Something happens to our kids or our spouse or our friends, or something happens in the world that we look at, we can point at and say, that should not have happened.
That's right.
That's wrong. That is not just.
Yes.
Anger is an appropriate response.
Absolutely. Yeah. When my daughter was born, you talked about with your son too, the thought of someone doing something to her arouses great anger.
Yeah. 100%.
And the thought of things like kids being abused, the thought of things like sexual trafficking, the thought of things like domestic violence, mistreatment of elders, all of these things that we see in our world that are wrong and that are unjust. Anger is a normal, to be expected, healthy response to those kinds of situations as well. And so we need to be able to notice that emotion when it's building up in us. And we need to be able to name it.
Yes.
And we need to be able to share it rather than suppress it like so many of us do, like I tend to do, because of the impact that it has on us personally, as far as depressive symptoms and as far as relationships with others. We are commanded to be angry about those injustices and those threats to others that we care about, to ourselves as well, if we're being mistreated. And if people are in relationships where there's mistreatment or abuse of any kind, don't feel like anger is a wrong response or a sinful response.
Right.
That's a normal, healthy response that is very appropriate.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It is appropriate. Now, there is another side of that, though, that sometimes your anger might come out in inappropriate ways.
That's true.
And it may come out in inappropriate times.
Correct.
And so, though it is an appropriate emotion, how we handle it, well, that's another conversation entirely. And I think another element of that to pay attention to, that my good friend, been on the podcast before, Dr. Emily DeYoung, told me when I was first starting out in the therapy world. She said, hey, just remember, Josh, anger is a secondary emotion, not a primary emotion. So though anger is typically the go-to emotion for most men, and it is the emotion that we access early on in our development, anger in the emotional world is like the tip of the iceberg. Anger is what we see, but there's a whole lot more going on underneath it. And there's things like hurt, fear, sadness, worry, concern. There is a lot under the surface. And so anger, when expressed appropriately and when named appropriately, actually allows for us to dive into some of these deeper emotions that maybe we're not aware of because anger is the loudest voice, or it's masking some of that. I think that's probably also a reason why anger turns to depression, because when you deny anger, you inadvertently deny all of the other emotions that are underneath it, and you don't give them a voice.
Right.
You don't give them the opportunity to be named and navigated in the same way. And when we would be angry, we can name it, we can acknowledge it, and then we can move on to this whole be angry and do not sin, which is the inappropriate outlet for an appropriate response.
Yeah. That's the other half of the verse, right? Be angry, but in your anger, don't sin. And so there are healthy and unhealthy ways to deal with those emotions. And I think, like you were saying, for men, I think anger, it's easier to feel that than maybe hurt or sadness, because it can give us a sense of maybe power or control over the situation. So I think that can be a safer emotion for us to experience, especially as men.
Yeah, let's just camp on that for a minute. That I don't know if I've ever really thought about that. That it is, in some ways, for us, it feels safe to be angry over being sad, because anger we usually associate with strength and power.
Yes.
And sadness we associate with weakness and smallness, vulnerability. And I'd rather put on a strong front than give you the image or the idea that I am somehow not strong enough to handle this.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thought. I'm going to say something that might be a little controversial. And some of you listening may not like what I have to say, and that's okay. You can email me at joshz@fearlessfollower.org. Love to have a conversation. But I have often found that the men who tend to show the greatest strength physically or in their machismo, typically tend to be emotionally lacking when it comes to strength.
I think it can be a way of compensating.
That's kind of what I was getting at.
Right.
And again, that's a little controversial, and I am not pointing a finger at you if you're listening saying, well, if you work out a lot and you're really strong and you're really powerful, you're emotionally weak. That's not what I'm saying.
No.
I am saying, though, it's easier to put on a show than it is to be vulnerable, because people who are vulnerable and people who can deal with those emotions underneath, and they can express their anger in healthy ways, those are actually the people that tend to be the strongest.
Yeah. It's a whole different twist on strength, real strength.
It almost sounds biblical.
Ooh, amazing how that works.
Because I remember, one of the things that, the songs always say at Christmas time is that Jesus was meek and mild. And we would not ever say that the most sovereign being and powerful being in the universe was weak. But meekness and weakness are not the same thing. And I've heard it said that meekness is power under restraint. And anger, I think, if we are violent and we are aggressive, that is unrestrained power.
Yeah.
And that That's a different conversation altogether. That's where we get into the explosive outbursts. That's where we get into the hurtful comments. That's where we get into expressing our anger in ways that causes harm or lasting pain. That's when we get into violence and fighting. And those are all of the things that lead to the be angry, but in your anger, do not sin.
And I think it's important to recognize too that those angry outbursts behaviors you're talking about, we quickly recognize those as being sinful. But for those of us that tend to suppress, our withdrawing, our passive aggressive ways of getting back at people, our withdrawing ourself and our love from life or people, it's not as loud, or maybe it doesn't look as aggressive, but it's as sinful as the angry outburst type of behavior.
Are you trying to tell me that if I give my wife the silent treatment when I'm feeling frustrated, that I am sinning against her?
Guilty as charged as well. Yes. That's, I think, how God would view that too.
So it isn't so much in how it presents in terms of the behavioral outburst.
Yeah.
I think it's important to measure, when your anger is inappropriate, when it is in some way causing harm to another person. And you can harm people in a lot of different ways.
Yes.
You can harm people with a look.
Yeah.
You can harm people with silence.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that's typically a go-to, is we weaponize our silence.
Mm-hmm.
You can harm people with your words, and you, of course, can harm people with your body. You can also harm people with your emails.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the greatest forms of passive-aggressive behavior in the workplace is our emails and also triangulation. So just if we look at organizational health and we look at how people handle anger in organizations, Rick, if I've got a problem with you, but I don't want to directly deal with my, name my anger and my frustration, it's easier for me. My easier thing to do is go to somebody else and tell them how angry I am with you, so that I can force them to come and talk to you to tell you, hey, Rick, did you know, man, Josh is really not happy with you. And then you're like, oh my gosh, I should probably go talk to Josh. I'm like, oh, man, it's really okay. I mean, I mentioned something, but it's fine. We're good. And then it forces you to do the work of apologizing and all of that, all because that I lacked the spine.
Yeah.
A little controversial statement there. I lacked the spine.
Truth.
Or lacked the courage, or I didn't want to come to you and say, hey man, I'm really angry with you.
Yeah.
Well, we triangulate all the time. We triangulate in the workplace. We triangulate in our relationships. I know this is another controversial statement. I'm just feeling frisky today. But we often, and it's unfair, but we tend to gender stereotype and say that women are the ones who gossip. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you, I've been on a lot of job sites and construction companies, and I've been in a lot of rooms with men, and men are just as bad, if not more so. Yeah. Because the truth is we tend to triangulate there too. Yeah. And we process through our frustrations and our anger in ways that are not helpful or productive. Mm-hmm. They are harmful and destructive to individual relationships and to the culture of an organization.
100%. 100%. Yeah. So how are we supposed to deal with it?
That's a good question. That's why you're here.
Okay.
Rick, you're going to tell us.
Yeah.
How do we respond?
Yeah.
To anger, and what are some things that we can do when we're angry that are either helpful or constructive instead of harmful and destructive?
Yeah. 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 How do we be angry, but in our anger, don't sin? I think it's important to recognize, what are some of the physical things that we can begin to feel or experience when we're entering into some emotions of anger. And because it can begin to manifest itself in your body in ways that, for instance, I think for me, I start to feel a tightness in just my whole body, or even in my this area, my jaw. I just start to feel a tension, a sense of not being relaxed. And so paying attention to those early signs, just like in a car when the check oil light comes on, or your gas is getting low and that signal comes on. When we start to experience some of those early physical signs that can come along with anger, it's important to pay attention to that.
So you'll feel anger in your body. I feel anger in my mind.
Okay.
Sometimes I feel it in my body, but usually I feel it in my mind. So I have these things called anger fantasies. I don't know if you've ever had one of these, but they're super common when you're driving. What we do is when people pull in front of us, or, Rick, I've said this a couple of times lately, but if I had one superpower, I mean, I've won a lot of different superpowers, but right now in this season of my life, if I had one superpower, it would be the ability to astral project into the car of the person who's at the front of the line on M40, holding up traffic of 50 cars behind them because they think it's a good idea to drive 35 in a 55. And I just want to be able to project my consciousness into that car and say, hi, excuse me.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are 50 cars behind you that also have a place to be. And though it's 55 right now, typically we go 60 to 65 on this road. And so if you could just at a minimum speed up 25 miles an hour, that would be great. That's an anger fantasy.
Okay.
Now, I can think through that in seconds. It actually takes me longer to explain it to you than me imagining myself in those scenarios. And what I found, especially when I work with individuals who are processing through anger, a typical response to anger right away is to start thinking through all of the ways that you would act out your anger in your mind toward that person or that group of people. Those anger fantasies are an indication that, hey, this is happening. So there's a physical side, but then there's also a mental side. And what are some of the things that we can do physically? Because if it happens in our body, then is there something that we can do in our body to address the anger, acknowledge it, and to even get it out?
Yeah. For me, personally, I find that getting that energy that you feel when you're angry out in a physical way, in a constructive way, instead of lashing out on a person or an object that I shouldn't be lashing out at, expending some physical energy in exercise. Yeah. Or, nowadays, they have these rage rooms.
They do.
Right?
Destruction therapy, it's called.
Destruction therapy. It's got a name.
Yep. I want to build one here at the church.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think it'd be amazing.
And I think about the story where Jesus overturned the tables in the temple.
Yeah.
He did something physical.
He did.
There.
He was angry.
He never sinned. He was angry. So anger, as we talked about, is not a sin. And the way he expressed it was not a sin, but he expressed it in a physical way. Well.
You're right. I appreciate you saying that. And, I find that's true. I'm at my best emotionally and mentally when I'm working out every morning.
Yeah.
Even if it's just 30 minutes on the tread climber or lifting weights. And you and I have talked about that in the last couple of weeks. I've been making concerted efforts to do that, not just for my physical health, but for my emotional health, because I got stuff going on and the body keeps the score. The body holds on to all that. And so if we can get that out, going for a walk, just getting away in space, but physically just distancing yourself from it for a period of time. Doing some push-ups.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another physical thing I think we can do is writing it out.
Oh yeah.
Or journaling. Because not everyone loves to exercise.
That's true.
Right. But I guess exercise doesn't have to be this super intense thing. Like you said, like a walk or just giving yourself some space.
Yep.
But physically writing it out, doing like a rough draft, an unedited,
unfiltered rough draft where you can write it out and nobody's going to see it. I will say, write it out on a piece of paper or on your notes on your phone. Don't write it out on Facebook where you are inclined to hit enter. Some of us, so nobody wants to see your dirty laundry in real life. They also don't want to see it in your virtual life. That is not a safe way. First of all, it's not going to come out the way that you want, number one. And number two, it's not a safe way to process through how you're feeling emotionally. So I appreciate that, but I think for those of us listening, be careful, and also be careful too of just what you're viewing when you do that, because I don't know if you've heard of this at all, but there's this whole TikTok phenomenon right now of angry wives. That they get on there and they rage against their husbands and their kids, and like they're just like essentially just talking about how much they hate. And I'm sure men do that too. I haven't seen the research for that. But there's this whole, and what happens is you watch this and you scroll through it, you doom scroll through it, and you spend hours listening to other women talk about how they are angry with their kids or they hate their husbands or how their husbands suck and they're not doing enough. And it's really interesting is the more you listen to that, the more it starts to impact the way that you think and feel. And that's another reality is like, be careful what you take in.
Right.
And physically though, like it's not about like, be careful what you take in, be more intentional about what you get out.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
What about some of the mental, what can we do for some of the mental things? Like for me, who I'm the guy who fantasies, I have fantasized about anger. Yeah. What can I do?
Yeah. Yeah. I think giving yourself permission to feel the anger. And we've talked about this earlier too, giving yourself permission to feel it. Naming it for what it is, using some of these effective or constructive rather than destructive ways of getting it out. For instance, I think about David in the Psalms, and I love the Psalms because David and other people that are writing are being honest. They're giving themselves permission to express all of the emotion. They're naming the emotions. From a spiritual perspective, they're questioning God. They're railing against God.
Yeah.
And so, when we're having those destructive fantasies, or when I'm starting to withdraw and noticing the behavioral manifestations of my anger, be honest about it with myself, with God. If faith is a big part of your life, invite God into the process. And then with safe people,
share it,
hash it out, share it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. It is interesting. I had this moment when I was driving a couple of days ago. I'm on M40. Someone's up ahead of me, per the usual, going under the speed limit. And I was angry. I was starting to feel it, starting to fantasize about what I would do. And I had this moment of like, okay, I'm angry. Then it's like, why am I angry? Like, what's really going on here?
Mm.
And why is it that somebody driving under the speed limit is bugging me so much? Well, underneath it all, wouldn't you know, I was stressed out that I was going to be late. Yeah. And me being late is a trigger for my own insecurities. It's driven from a narrative that I had. It's a young man, that you're just never late. We're on time for everything. Early's on time. Yeah. On time is late. Yeah. That was a motto that I heard repeated all the time. Okay. And that I would somehow show disrespect for the people, and I would somehow seem less than. Yeah. Again, all of this is happening in my mind faster than I can even say it out loud to you. Yeah. And you're right in acknowledging that, and then having just even a short prayer of, God, I am angry because of this car, and I'm stressed out, and I need you. Yeah. Now, that's not going to change the person driving ahead of me, and it's not going to take away all of it. Right. But it loses its intensity. Yeah. In that. Yeah. Yeah. And you brought up a great point about, like, the tip of the iceberg is the anger and then the fantasies. But okay, God, or doing some introspection, what is really beneath this? What are the lies I'm believing? Yes. About myself, or those old rules or ways of thinking about how life works, or being willing to go deeper and have those other below the surface things be exposed and come into the light. What about some coping skills? Are there any skills and tools that we haven't talked about that might be helpful when we're angry? Yeah. Good question. So when it comes to communicating the anger, we've talked about physical exercise as a good thing to do, and journaling. But then when we're sharing the emotions, sharing our anger with other people, there's healthy, constructive ways to do that, and there's the opposite. And a lot of times when we're angry, we want to be blaming. We want to come out with the you statements, and you made me feel this way, and you did this, and you, as opposed to what they call them I statements, right? I'm feeling angry. I feel hurt by this. Yes. I was caught off guard. I wasn't prepared for what you were going to say. Yeah. Making sure that you're staying on your side of the fence, so to speak, in the conversation. That's so good. Yeah. And that is a healthy way to say it. Like, hey, this is my emotional reality. Yeah. 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 And on the flip side, when someone is expressing their anger to us, it's real easy. We can start to feel that tension and anger inside us, and that wanting to defend ourselves. But instead, taking a couple deep breaths and just really listening. Yeah. And not listening to figure out what my response is going to be, but okay, so what I'm hearing is you're feeling this. That's right. That's right. So, and I appreciate you saying deep breaths, because breathing is also, I mean, we glossed over a little bit. It's also a physical thing to do. Breathing in, we've talked about breathing so many times on the podcast. We'll say it again. When you're angry, taking time to just, 2 minutes of some deep breathing, man, that's super helpful, because it just brings you down, helps you to regulate, maybe think clearly. That blood flowing to the back of your brain is going to be really intense if you don't take a couple of deep breaths. So, is there, we're coming on some time here, Rick. Is there any other thoughts that you have, any lasting thoughts that you want to leave us with when we talk about anger? Maybe one more thing to think about is just the place of gratitude in life.
because there's always plenty of things to get upset about.
Yeah.
But in the midst of those emotions, things that we get upset about, things that we get angry about, can we find places in the middle of those intense emotional episodes to take those deep breaths and find places to be grateful for in them?
And that's a great point, because anger and gratitude live in different parts of the brain. And when you force yourself into a practice of gratitude, you're essentially forcing your brain to focus on something else. Now, you may still be angry and you may still feel it, but you're at least Jedi mind tricking your brain into like a neural hack of finding a different avenue for that neural energy or that emotional energy. That's such a great point, Rick. Well, we could just go on, and I know you have meetings today and I have meetings today, so we can't. But I was just so thankful for the time that you've spent here, and looking forward to continuing talking about things like anger and depression. And just so if you're listening in here and you've got questions about anger, you want to reach out to Rick or get some more information from him, you can reach out to us at chaplaincy@fearlessfollower.org. We're also really interested in working with organizations, talking about how anger impacts us individually and corporately. And we'd love to be able to come in and share some of that information with you as well, and your organization or your business. And you can learn more about us at fearlesschaplaincy.org. That's our website, and we'd love to connect with you. We're going to continue on in this conversation as we lean into different types of depression in our next episode, and we are thankful for the time you've spent here. That's all we have for you now. We will talk with you later.